So you've actually said quite a bit there that I want to kind of unpack and then tie back into both your article as well as your book, because it really, this election, in my opinion, has really, I don't know if demarcated is the word I'm looking for, but it's really delineated the differences in the the divisions in the black community that we kind of gloss over a lot of times. And we speak of the black community as though we're a monolith. And even from the racial justice perspective, we speak as though black people experience this racial injustices the same way. But you disagree with that assertion in the Jacobin piece. Tell me a little bit more about how you see the experiences and the differences between the black experiences from a class level.
Well, so if you think about the neoliberal turn of cities, I know we're going to talk about my book about that in a second, but if you think about it, in order for cities to become kind of more entrepreneurial and in a space where they don't necessarily have the money to provide for social services, and they don't have the money, the state doesn't want to give them the money, federal government doesn't want to give them money, what they often turn to is policing, right? And this policing takes two forms. In the case of places like Ferguson, it's about extracting revenue from folk. It's like a revenue generator. In the case of places like Baltimore, New York, what is an attempt to kind of police and surveil the poor, right? So in the case of Baltimore, what we've seen is spending on police has increased from 145 million in 1990 to about 475 million now. And that policing is concentrated in a couple of districts, one of which includes the neighborhood that Freddie Gray was in, right? So when we've had this conversation about policing going back 20, 30 years in kind of the modern moment, what we've done is we've kind of articulated policing as a problem that affects all black people equally, right? When at every point in time, there are class dynamics that are unique, right? So, I think you and I are about the same age. You remember when people used to organize against driving while black, right? Yeah. And we articulate it as a police problem that affects all black people. When the reality is you're only guilty of driving while black if A, you have a car in the first place, and B, you have a car you're not supposed to have. Right. So that driving while black is really a middle class dynamic that we articulate as something that affects black people broadly. Right. When we think about aggressive policing, right, in this moment, whether we're talking about harassment or we're talking about murder, what we're talking about is a dynamic that, yes, black people are more likely to fall victim to than their white counterparts. But what it really is a black dynamic that affects predominantly working class and poor populations. Right. So I dealt with this myself when I experienced a series of unfortunate incidents, again, I talk about in the book. And there was a moment in time when I was driving a hoopty, right? So I was driving a hoopty, had one headlight out, and I was actually trying to take the long way back to the crib in order to make sure the police didn't stop me, right? But the police did stop me. I didn't have a license because I left it over one of our fraternity's brother's house. I didn't have a photo ID, right? So I left it in the office, so I couldn't whip out my Hopkins ID and imply that I was a professor, right? I didn't even know whose car I was driving because my then wife, it was one of her friends, and I knew her, but not able to say, oh, this is whose car it is. So if the racial dynamic works as far as police, the way it's supposed to work, in that case, I'm supposed to be at the very least given 1 or 2 tickets, and at most, I'm arrested for potentially stealing a car, and then maybe I'm actually beaten down, right? Or even killed. I got away with nothing, no ticket, nothing. And that happened to me 2 or 3 times, not the same type of thing, but a number of times I was stopped by police, dead to rights, and got nothing, right? They didn't know I was a Hopkins professor. I asked one of my fraternity brothers to see if they had this special Hopkins list that I was a part of, and they didn't have it, right? So, I mean, real talk, because I didn't know, right? I was like, what's going on here? And then I was like, this is a class dynamic, right? This is clearly a class dynamic. And I'm not the only one that's affected by this. So what I want to do in that Jacobin piece is unpack that class dynamic within Black communities, right? Because when you're talking about just Black people, I study Black politics, it can't be race that explains these the differences in how folks are treated. And I thought that given that we're having all these discussions about the police, given that we're seeing more activism about against the police than any time that I can remember, it's really important to deal with that class issue.
And you dealt with it. You dealt with it in such a fabulous way, in my opinion. As I was reading it, the portions that stood out to me was that you had to ask yourself whether or not you were some type of super Negro that would not get accosted by the police. But help me and help the audience to understand a little bit better. Then, how did you determine that it was a class dynamic? Because you stated that you were driving a hoopty. Was it the neighborhood that you were in? Was it the your personal profile? How did that work?
Right. So so I was in the Western District. I was about probably about 1.5 miles away from where Freddie Gray was killed, less than a mile from Endowment, which was one of the epicenters of the uprising. I was a block away from a really Tony Black neighborhood in Baltimore, which is where I was living. But I was stopped kind of on the edge, right? So the best I can figure, it was my language and my tone, because class isn't just a matter of how much loot you have; it's also how you carry yourself, right? So I'm talking to the police. I'm really clear. I'm looking at him in his eye, and I'm telling him the story, and he's telling and I know he's got a type in his head, and he's probably checking off. Okay, he's like he's older. He's talking with the King's English. Like all these different checkoffs that says to him, I'm not the droid he's looking for.
Yeah. And then you also pointed out in the piece, and well, actually, before I go there, because you just opened up a can of worms there, because some people would interpret that to be respectability politics, right? So how do you distinguish? You're not saying that was a good reason. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm not. Be really clear. I am not making an argument that in order to not get stopped by the police, you need to act like me. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that police officers use a metric in order to determine who they're going to harass and stop and who they're not. Right? Because one way to think about it is in a city like Baltimore, there are so many Black folk where if they were going to harass all of them, they wouldn't have time to do their real job, which again is really policing poor working class Black folk, right?
Absolutely.